Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to join you again for another in the series of trade webinars that we're bringing you together with the American Gear Manufacturers Association and the American Bearing Manufacturers Association. It's been a bit of a summer break. There's a lot to talk about what's happened this summer, and we're certainly in the middle of a very exciting election season here in Washington, and that's the topic of our webinar for today. I'm Nate Boland. I'm with the law firm of K&L Gates, based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased to be joined today by my new colleagues, Ryan Carney and Scott Gelbman, also from our Washington, D.C. office, who are right in the midst of and in the thick of all the political issues swirling as we lead up to the November 5th election. It's certainly an election of consequence, probably one of the most consequential elections in a long time, if not a generation or so. And there are a number of issues that are of relevance to the bearing and gear industries that we're going to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over briefly to Ryan and Scott to give a little bit more on their background. And they certainly, as I think you'll hear in just a minute, are very well qualified to speak on these issues, and again, are very tapped into what is going on here in Washington and then around the country politically. So Ryan, Scott, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Nate. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Carney. I joined the firm K&L Gates about a year ago. I came from Capitol Hill, where I was a chief of staff to a Republican member of Congress from Wisconsin for 5 years. Prior to that, chief of staff to a Republican member of Congress from New Jersey for 4 years. And prior to that, I worked at the National Republican Congressional Committee, which is the campaign arm for House Republicans. So I am the Republican witness at the table.
Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Gelbman, also government affairs advisor at the firm. I have been at K&L Gates for about 4 years now. And prior to joining the firm, I spent more than 6 years as an advisor to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, handling a variety of issues, including sustainability, agriculture, science and technology. And in between my time on the Hill and at K&L Gates, I worked as an on-the-record spokesperson for Ford Motor Company's government relations arm, handling a whole range of issues that are pertinent to our discussion today. So looking forward to it.
Well, great. Well, thank you both. One other thing I should have mentioned at the outset is we do certainly welcome your questions as we go along. I know many of you will be looking at the election season and a lot of the issues and have questions specific to your company, to your industry, to what this means for investment and the direction of business in the years ahead. So we definitely welcome those. If you can put them in the chat, we'll try to address as many of those questions as we can in the time we have available. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ryan and Scott to pick up the thread on what has been happening and what's likely to happen as we enter the election.
Great. Thank you. So we live in a 50-50 country. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. If you look at the national polls, former President Trump had a sizable lead towards the end of the Biden campaign. That wasn't necessarily people coming to the Republican Party. That is a lot of Democratic voters that were completely dispirited by President Biden's debate performance and campaign operation. So as you see a surge of support for Vice President Harris, a lot of that is Democrats coming home. People that should be voting Democrat are voting Democrat. If you look at an average of what we would consider the most credible national polls through this past Monday, Harris has a 2.2% lead. That really doesn't matter much for two reasons. One, the margin of error in most polls is about 4. And 2, we don't have a national election. We have a race to 270 electoral votes. So if you look at the 7 states that are considered the battlegrounds, and that's Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, if you average out those polls, Trump has a 0.1% lead. Again, with a 4% margin of error, it's tied. It's really close, which is what it feels like anecdotally. And the past few elections, really since the year 2000, have shown that this is a divided country politically. So in that race to 270, Harris likely has about 225 electoral votes banked. She's going to win New York and California. Trump has 219 banked. He's going to win Mississippi and Alabama and West Virginia. Again, it's a race for those 7 states, which is about 94 electoral votes. So it really is a coin flip right now. A month and a half is an eternity in politics. If you look back a month and a half ago, how many major stories have broken since then? Anything could happen, but as of right now, it's a very close race. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So, as Ryan said, about 50-50, nation divided, but the nation does agree that Americans right now are feeling like the country is on the wrong track. That's very high historically, and less than 30% of folks think America is moving in the right direction. Although they agree that America is on the wrong track, they actually disagree about why. Some folks feel like the economy is their number one issue. Others believe the uptick in violent crime, immigration issues, issues coming out of the Supreme Court, like reproductive rights and Roe. So different issues are driving that high percentage of folks that think the country's on the wrong track. But generally, folks seem to be not particularly pleased right now. Next slide. That leads into the future of the Senate. And right now, as everybody knows, Dems have a 51-49 majority. It's a tough map, actually. There really are 47 Senate Democrats with 4 independents that are caucusing with the Democrats. Joe Manchin from West Virginia announced that he was retiring, pretty much guaranteeing the GOP their 50th seat. And Montana, up until recently, had really been leaning more towards the GOP in the Senate race, although there have been some comments from the Republican candidate Tim Sheehy that have kind of put that seat even more hotly contested in the last couple of days. There are 2 Democrat held seats that are toss-ups in Michigan and Ohio. Other competitive seats include Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but also recently we've seen 2 new states that are in the mix. Texas, with Congressman Colin Allred, actually, there are a few polls showing him taking the lead, obviously within the margin of error there. And Florida, where we have former Congresswoman Debbie Muxarel-Powell, actually only about a point or 2 behind Senator Rick Scott. All of that's to say, could a decisive Harris win help pull some of these seats over the finish line and lead to a Democratic Senate next Congress? Absolutely. It's too close to call. What does a Harris landslide victory look like? It probably needs to be at least 4 or 5 points for a state like Florida or Texas to turn blue. But Republicans are certainly having to spend a lot of time and resources right now defending those seats, which is taking resources away from important races like Ohio and Montana.
Just one thing to keep in mind, if it's a 50-50 race or 50-50 Senate, the party that controls the White House, the vice president, is the tiebreaker. So if the Republicans end with 50 and Harris wins, the Democrats will retain the majority and vice versa if Trump were to win. Next slide. All right, so in the House, you need 218 seats to win the majority. In the House, all 435 seats are up for re-election, unlike the Senate, where there's only 34 every 2 years. Republicans currently have a 3-seat majority. They have 221 right now. The Cook Political Report is seen as the most well-regarded, nonpartisan political handicapping service. They estimate that there's currently 208 likely Republican seats and 203 likely Democratic seats. That leaves about 24 that are considered toss-ups. Interestingly, of those toss-ups, they're almost split evenly between those held by Democrats and those held by Republicans. But if you look at those seats held by the Republicans that are considered toss-ups, 10 of the 13 are in New York and California. These are states that are not targeted on the presidential level, where Trump will get either in the high 30s or low 40s in terms of percent of the popular vote. Vice President Harris is going to run up her popular vote total in those states. So it presents those 10 Republican incumbents with a very interesting needle to thread, which is they need to show that they are supportive of Trump to their 40% base while appealing to independents and Democrats in their districts as a problem solver, as somebody that will work across the aisle, as somebody that isn't Donald Trump, to win. And so if those Republicans can win those seats, it's likely the Republicans would hold the House, but the House is much like the presidency, it's a coin flip. One addition, though, is if Vice President Harris or former President Trump were to start to pull ahead, as Scott said, a 4-point win, a strong electoral college showing, it is likely that the number of toss-ups would expand. The party that's losing the White House would likely have additional seats become toss-ups. So you could see in a Harris landslide, still 11 Democratic seats as toss-ups, but maybe upwards of 25 Republican seats would become toss-ups in that scenario.
Quickly, two things. I know we mentioned some candidate issues on the Republican side in Montana on the Senate race. There are also a few other candidate issues that could have a big impact on the presidential or the House. North Carolina, the lieutenant governor who's running for governor now. I'm sure everybody's seen the reports of the incendiary kind of remarks and behavior allegedly that are coming out of his camp. If that actually makes it so that Vice President Harris wins North Carolina, I think she wins in about 90% of scenarios. That would be a really big deal. Additionally, we've seen some issues coming out of Congressman D'Esposito's seat in Long Island. Those sorts of issues really could make or break the House turning one way or the other. So we'll just have to stay tuned to see how voters react to these issues.
Yeah. Great.
Next slide.
Next slide.
So that's all to say. The only thing we know is we really don't know. It really is 50-50. There's a wide range of outcomes that are possible. We could have a Trump win and the Dems take the House. We could have a Harris win with GOP taking both the House and the Senate. There's really just so many different combinations and so much time left between now and the election that we'll just all have to stay tuned.
Yeah, I would add just a historical anomaly is it is very credible that the Democrats could flip the House, and it's very credible that the Republicans could flip the Senate. And it doesn't happen where both chambers flip, but they flip to the opposite, to different parties. Typically, if the chambers flip, it's a Republican landslide or a Democratic landslide. And if one doesn't flip, it often means that, for example, in 2010, the Republicans flipped the House. They didn't flip the Senate, but they picked up seats in the Senate. That would show that there is a clear mandate, similar to 2018 as well, a mandate for one side of governance rather than the other. As of right now, neither side can lay claim to any sort of a mandate. Again, it's a 50-50 country.
Or incumbency, really.
Or incumbency,
right?
Yeah.
It's just a fascinating where you have a current vice president running against a former president,
right?
And people are unhappy. So
right.
Who has the advantage of incumbency?
Right. Yeah.
It's unclear.
It's usually throw the bums out in this type of an election where everyone's unhappy. Well, who's the bum? Is it the former president who was once an incumbent, or is it the incumbent party that already threw their president out and now we have a brand new candidate? So it's a very unique election.
Yeah. Next slide.
All right, here's how Trump will try to win. He's going to try to make Vice President Harris out to be Vice President Selena Meyer from Veep. Unserious, unfit for the job. Her laugh is off-putting. She talks in circles, doesn't really make much sense. That's how he'll try to portray her. Prices are through the roof. Inflation will be blamed on the Biden-Harris administration as a 20% tax on your groceries since they took office. The world's on fire. There's wars all over the place. There's unrest on college campuses. Anti-Semitism on college campuses is ugly. All this will be blamed on Biden-Harris policies. It used to be the Biden administration, and now that Harris is the nominee, it's the Biden-Harris administration. From the Republican perspective, there's a migrant crisis at the southern border, and violent crime in our major cities. It scares everybody. So that'll be the Trump message. The last 4 years are worse than the previous 4 years were, and we don't really know who she is other than the fact that she's not ready. That's the message.
Next slide. So why will Vice President Harris win? Well, first of all, she's running against former President Donald Trump, who's incredibly unpopular. And she's not going to let anybody forget that, nor is she going to let anybody forget really how that first debate went. And she's going to continue playing those clips in all the battleground states. This last administration is probably one of, if not the most consequential in our history, with the IRA, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The supply chain is coming back to America, and it's something that the vice president's going to be running on. She's also going to be running on renewed enthusiasm from young people. We're seeing that in Climate Week in New York City, that the young people are really, really excited about investments in climate and the IRA. Also, a big pillar of the Biden-Harris administration has been trying to help keep medical bills down and help with folks that are struggling with student loans. And she's going to continue to talk about that, as well as recent decisions coming out of the Supreme Court, like Roe and others, making sure those are top of mind for voters. Next slide.
All right. Next slide.
If we have a President Harris, I think you can expect a lot more of what we've been seeing. She is going to be making a big speech on manufacturing in a couple of hours, where she'll continue to talk about tax cuts for the middle class and folks making under $400,000 a year. A continued focus on lowering drug prices and cutting the cost of healthcare, as well as kind of focusing on emissions reductions and pro-environmental regulations.
And with a President Trump, unsurprisingly, it'll be similar to his first administration. Unlike this administration, will be a bigger emphasis on fossil fuels, lighter touch from regulators. One change, he will be much more pro-crypto and digital asset than he was. He was a little more skeptical in his first term. And then I would also add something that this audience may be interested in. Tariffs will come into play in a second Trump term. Next slide.
Yeah, so I was hopeful, Ryan and Scott, that when we got to the crystal ball slide, you guys were going to stake out some bets on exactly who would win which house and which chamber.
We can. We're happy to do it. Yeah.
It's a dangerous thing these days.
Yeah, it is a dangerous thing. And I think we're going to be aligned on most of it. But I'm happy to go first. I think in a couple of weeks, we'll see a tightly contested presidential in which we have Vice President Harris coming out on top. I think we'll have a U.S. Senate that's most likely Republican, and that we have a House that is Democratic. But those are really all on the margins. So we'll have to see.
The thing I'm most confident about is a Republican Senate. Second most confident would when, and by that it's maybe 51% confidence level, is that Trump will win. I think he has an advantage in the Electoral College, and that's what the race is. It's not a popular vote. And then I think if Trump wins, I think the House would stay Republican, but it could be a 218 to 217, which would be very fun.
Wow.
But I think if Harris wins, I think then that the House would flip, but also would be an incredibly small majority in the House. I think whoever wins the White House will likely carry the House across with them, and I think the Senate operates independently.
And it's changing hour by hour. So
Yeah, right. One piece of advice: don't get spun up, no matter who you like, on a poll that comes back bad. A lot of these sample sizes are like 400 voters, which means if somebody's cranky when they answer the phone, it skews the numbers. So look, don't get spun up over polls. They show kind of direction, not precision.
And in a race that is going to have millions and millions of votes cast, it's most likely going to come down to what, 75,000 or 100,000 votes in a couple of states.
Right.
So
in 2020, President Biden had 5 percentage points more than President Trump, but he won by 43,000 votes out of almost 200 million cast because of where the votes. Again, running up the score in Los Angeles County doesn't really help the Harris team at all. It's Kenosha County, Wisconsin, and Bucks County, Pennsylvania are much more important.
And on the Senate side of things, I mean, a couple of recent examples of races that have been decided by just a couple of votes. I mean, in New Hampshire, Senator Hassan's race was decided by a little more than 1,000 votes last cycle. Senator Cortez Masto's race was decided by 7,000 votes. So some of these Senate races, like Senator Tester's and Senator Brown's, they're really going to come down to just a couple of votes. So it really could go either way.
Which means we will likely not know when we go to bed on election night who has won the House. Almost certainly we will not know.
That's actually the safest bet.
Right. Yeah. We will. I'm optimistic on the Republican side, so I think we will know on the Senate side. But it is also very possible that we don't know on the presidential side. If it comes down to the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Pennsylvania is decided by 50,000 votes, we're probably not going to know for several days, if not weeks.
So I've got a number of questions for you both I'd like to raise to kind of tease out some of those remarks. They're very interesting. You know, sticking with the topic of a few thousand votes deciding a lot of key elections here. What are your predictions for voter turnout for this election? Do you see it? You get the sense that I think we're all reflecting on this webinar that this is a consequential election and therefore voters are going to show up and vote? Or are you hearing things that are suggesting people are so frustrated, the 68% of people who think we're going the wrong direction, that they're just throwing out their hands and saying we're not going to participate? Or is it somewhere in between those?
I'll take it first.
Take first.
So I think Donald Trump in the news drives turnout for the Democrats. Donald Trump on the ballot drives turnout for Republicans. And so you see that in 2018 and 2022, where 2018 was a great year for Democrats and 2022 was not as good of a year for Republicans as expected, in large part because Trump was not on the ballot. As long as Trump is in the news, Democrats' hair will be on fire to vote against his party. But when Trump is on the ballot, there are millions of voters that want to vote for him, but generally don't care about midterm elections or down ballot things. So I actually think turnout will be very high. I think the higher it is, the better it is for Trump because of that kind of, I vote when he's on the ballot kind of a person. And I also think that political parties are becoming increasingly more sophisticated in how to drive turnout and monitoring who is not returning absentee ballots. That will have an effect of driving turnout considerably.
So I agree with you that turnout for this election is going to be high, but I actually think that turnout being high is good for Harris in certain places. In Pennsylvania is a great example. Voter turnout in Philadelphia in particular was quite low last election cycle. And I think in those sorts of places in Pennsylvania and Ohio, the more voters that are turning out, I think holistically, that's a better thing for Harris. But that's okay for us to agree to disagree on that point.
And you've both mentioned now Pennsylvania several times, and Ryan, you mentioned Wisconsin. In addition to those two states, are there other states you kind of are ranking as battleground states for the presidential election? I know you mentioned, key states that may influence the Senate or the House races, but what's your list of kind of battleground states for the presidential and the electoral college?
I think North Carolina is a new one that's really come on to kind of the sphere. So I think if you see North Carolina going to Harris, it's a bad night for Trump and Republicans. So that's something I'm really watching closely. Ryan, I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting because of the electoral system or the electoral college, you could have a lot of these states come down to a tenth or 2/10 of a point, but they, like dominoes, they all fall for one candidate.
Yeah.
And so I find it hard to believe that Trump could win the presidency while losing a state like North Carolina. I mean, the easiest path for Trump is North Carolina and Georgia, two southern states, and Pennsylvania. And Nate, yes, Pennsylvania, in my opinion, is the most important state. I don't know how somebody credibly wins without it. Because again, if Harris loses Pennsylvania, probably
really
means
hard.
she's lost Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona, and that's really hard. I think dominoes will fall. The total vote in the swing states could be very tight, but they could all go for one at the end.
Arizona is another good one.
Yeah.
So another thing that struck me about your remarks is that you both seem to be indicating that the chances of a divided House versus Senate, regardless of which party controls which, that is much higher, that we'll see that scenario than we would one party controlling both chambers. Is that a fair summary? And
That's a fair assessment.
What do you think are the odds of that not coming true?
Well, I think part of the reason why it's a good assessment is the map, again, there's only 34 Senate races this year out of 100. So those 34, just by good luck for the Republicans and bad luck for the Democrats, happen to be in states that either are true swing states or lean Republican. And then of the House is the entire country, all 435. And so I think, again, like my prediction, if Harris wins the presidency, I could see how she brings across a lot of these House seats in purple districts. And certainly, like I mentioned, the Republican seats in blue states are going to be challenging to hold.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A very interesting set of scenarios. So while we've been talking, we have up on the screen this slide about trade issues, and we'll try to unpack some of this as we go along in the remainder of the presentation. But I just wanted to pause here because I think, and we've talked about this in past trade webinars for AGMA and ABMA, but there has, over the past 4 to 5+ years, been something of a constant theme in policymaking in the trade space that there is, generally speaking, a fair amount of consensus in Washington on both parties about measures that are going to be supported. The parties may be coming at those measures and that consensus from different perspectives and for different reasons, but there has been a striking amount of bipartisanship on things like what the U.S. policy towards China is going to be on export controls and trade, tariffs, and what the policy is going to be in terms of supporting domestic manufacturing through things like the CHIPS Act and the IRA and other programs that you were mentioning, Scott, which I think both have passed with a significant majority in a lot of cases, but also, there seems to be support within districts, and we have a map that we can look at in a few minutes about that. But I'm curious, in the past few days, we've seen some announcements come out from President Trump about additional proposals on tariffs. I want to take a minute and talk about those. Was hoping, you both could give your views on the proposals that were covered yesterday in the news about potentially additional tariffs that Trump would propose to put in place on companies that are not locating manufacturing in the United States or potentially offshoring manufacturing assets that are currently in the U.S. So I was hoping you could kind of give a background on that. And then, Scott, I know you mentioned that Vice President Harris is about to give a speech on manufacturing, so I can't expect you to tell us what the contents of that are, but if you could talk a little bit about what you think those predictions would be. Before you do all that, let me just kind of touch on what's on the slide and on the screen at the moment, which is, one of the key differences in the trade-related parts of the policy of President Trump versus Vice President Harris is on the area of what additional tariffs the U.S. may want to put in place on imports from certain countries. And as I think everybody who's listening has heard on past trade webinars, we have the 25% Section 301 tariffs that were put in place under President Trump on imports from China. Those remain in effect today, and in fact, in some cases, have been increased by the Biden administration with regard to imports in recent months. We just had some of those go into effect just a few days ago. And overall, the consensus view in Washington has been that those are important things that we need to keep in place as a matter of trade policy with China. You see, though, President Trump, led in part by his former U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, proposing a broader set of tariffs on imports from not only China, but potentially other countries as well. And not only that, but also increasing further the tariffs on imports from China. This issue came up in the debate on September 10th, and you had a colloquy, part of which is quoted here on the screen, between President Trump and Vice President Harris, where President Trump is saying that this is something that we need to do as a matter of policy to try to shift manufacturing investment in the U.S. and have countries, as he put it, pay us back for U.S. contributions to the world globally. And Harris is calling this a tax on consumers. That's the party that's eventually going to, the segment of the population that's going to be hit the hardest by these tariffs. It's not the foreign exporters, but it's the importers who are going to pass that cost on to the regular consumer. So I'm curious what you make of this development, and also, if you could talk a little bit about what Trump has been proposing with regard to potential offshoring of manufacturing, and maybe Scott, if you want to kick that off, and then Ryan jump in.
Sure. Thanks, Nate. I think what we'll hear from Harris today is not going to be revolutionary or groundbreaking. I think a lot of what Harris's administration, you're going to see a lot of similarities between her and President Biden. Look, I think between the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act, this administration has been really, really focused on kind of upgrading our supply chains and reinvesting in American manufacturing. So I think she's going to focus on those. Yesterday, it looks like the actual first CHIPS award, that the money is starting to actually come out rather than it be MOUs. So I think you'll continue to see a lot more announcements over the coming weeks, and that the vice president will talk today about those important investments and how she's looking to build on those in the coming weeks and months. And Congress is going to have a big role to play in that. Whether, we had all those bills come up during China Week, or things that were left off the table during China Week that could, end up coming up in a NDAA or kind of a lame duck scenario, or things that could come up next year. We've been told pretty pointedly that the bipartisan China Select Committee is here to stay regardless of who wins the House, and that those efforts are just going to be ongoing. But Ryan, I don't know if you want to address the Trump.
So before you do that, Ryan, I just want to pause you, Scott, because you threw out a couple of terms that I think some in our audience likely know very well and others may know less well. You mentioned NDAA and you mentioned China Week. Could you provide a little bit of background on what those?
Of course, yes. So NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act. It happens every year for the past 60 or 70 years. It's one of those few bipartisan bills that remain, and it is to authorize the year ahead in defense spending. This year in particular, with kind of the lack of bipartisan vehicles, there is an opportunity. It is not guaranteed that during the lame duck, and the lame duck session being after we know the results of the election, there are going to be about 6 weeks of legislative activity in between kind of mid-November and early January before the new Congress, when everything that hasn't been passed in this session of Congress has to be completely redone from scratch, reintroduced and repassed with the House and Senate to become law, to kind of pick up these pieces of outstanding bipartisan legislation and put them in different vehicles. And it sounds like NDAA is a prime candidate for some pieces of competition and trade related matters that have come out of both the House and the Senate. China Week was a week, I guess, gosh, feels like months ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago now, in which a number of competition related matters were voted on the House floor. Those mostly originated out of discussions from the China Select Committee, which is a special committee that needs to be reauthorized every session of Congress. They do not have explicit legislative authority, but they are conveners and have helped bring together discussions that have informed different pieces of legislation from a number of bipartisan members in the House. We saw approximately 30 to 40 bills that were on the floor of the House, and they were wide-ranging, having to do with EVs and supply chains related to pharmaceuticals and biologics, amongst other things. That being said, there were a number of pieces of legislation that did not make that kind of week of activities, including de minimis and other items that could be of note.
No, thanks for that. And we'll come back to many of those topics in future webinars. So definitely stay tuned for that. There's a lot more to unpack there. Brian, over to you.
So when thinking about Trump, I think big picture, we've seen a major realignment of the two political parties over the past 15 years. This happens every 75 years or so. It seems like a million years ago that Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan were the standard bearers on the Republican side. And now both of them are pariahs among large segments of the Republican electorate. So free trade used to be ideological orthodoxy for Republicans. That's no longer the case. And it's really important to know that that is not because of or exclusive to Donald Trump. Donald Trump saw and has provided voice to a more populist segment of the electorate. And tariffs are the natural solution to some of the frustration seen by people in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Western Pennsylvania over the past 20-something years from presidents of both parties. And I also think when looking at Trump's comments with his specifics, 200%, 60%, 20%, I'm reminded of when he said he was going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. And then he was asked by the press, they said, well, the president of Mexico said they're not going to pay for it. And he said, well, the wall just got 5 feet taller. And that is instructive because when Democrats hear Trump speak, they take him very literally and they say, that's impossible. It doesn't follow linearly. When Republicans or conservative voters hear him speak, they take him seriously, not literally. So when I hear him give specifics on China and on tariffs and on making countries pay their fair share after we, sacrificed so much for them in the previous century, I hear somebody that says, I'm going to utilize tariffs. It's at my disposal. I don't have to deal with a dysfunctional Congress to do so. But the actual percentage amounts, I think Trump is a deal maker and he will take the best deal possible. And getting to the negotiating table, one way of doing so is by scaring your adversary considerably to get them to the negotiating table and say, let's make a deal. So I take him seriously that he is committed to American manufacturing and decoupling our dependence from China. I don't take him exactly literally in terms of the exact mechanism he's going to use at the time he's going to use it and the amount he's going to use.
Yeah, I share that viewpoint as well. I think, look, I'm not going to go out on a limb and predict who's going to win the House, Senate, or the presidency, but in the trade sphere, I think we've seen enough of that from his first term, and that seems to be the approach that his political instinct is to exactly search for that leverage. I also, suspect, and I think it's very likely that the environment we've been living in for the past 4 years since Biden took office is going to continue if we see a Vice President Harris on a lot of these issues. I think it becomes, and I'm interested in what both of you think about this. I think it becomes very difficult given the positions that Vice President Harris has been taking on the campaign trail, particularly in talking about U.S. manufacturing and support for organized labor, to walk back some of the tariffs that have been put in place. And so, putting together this chart, I think we're trying to picture here in this limited set of issues broadly under the umbrella of trade, you do see a striking amount of continuity between if we see a President Harris administration to the past Biden administration, and also strikingly a lot of continuity in a lot of these approaches if we see a second Trump term in office. The one main difference being on, well, what is the mechanism that we use, or what is the goal that we use tariffs towards? Is it to maintain sort of status quo and keep tariffs on some strategic imports like solar panels or EV batteries or electric vehicles, as President Biden has been doing, or is it, as Ryan was just saying, this search for leverage over negotiating partners and kind of everything is on the table? Let's use our the powers of the presidency to levy these tariffs as a way to get people to the bargaining table. Looking at the national security parts of international trade, law and policy generally, things like the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, export controls on U.S. technology and access to that technology, as well as sanctions policy. I think there's a fair amount of continuity and actually similarity between both candidates. The one maybe difference is that, again, Trump's instincts of being more willing to use some of these points as leverage and potentially a bargaining chip in negotiations, whereas you see much more of a kind of continuing ratcheting up of export controls and sanctions on the part of a Vice President Harris administration. So I'm not sure, Scott, Ryan, if you guys have any comments or views on that, but that's kind of, as we're looking at who is, what the statements of the two candidates are on these issues, but also sort of who is advising them on these issues. That's where we're kind of coming out, and if we had to summarize it.
I agree with that, Nate. I think most likely, regardless of who wins the election, they're going to be sort of hamstrung by Congress. I think a good example of that is the kind of the rhetoric and moving slightly adjacently to this subject, but on the IRA, and Trump saying he wants to kind of just rescind all funding that hasn't been obligated. But we have a letter that has 16 to 18 signatures from moderate House Republicans saying, we don't want to do that. Please don't do that. Well, most likely, even in aggressive scenarios, we're not going to have a majority that's 20 seats. It's most likely going to be another thing like this year, 5 seats, 10 seats at the most. So I think when it comes to needing congressional approval on things, it's going to be incredibly challenging to get anything outside of the defense authorization and keeping the government open debt limit. And I know we'll talk about this in a little bit. But just to double down on the fact that outside of what the president has authority to do himself, it's going to be incredibly challenging. It's going to be incredibly challenging to get congressional approval on things, and that's an issue.
I would add one thing. My take on Trump in regards to trade is most policymakers and politicians like to compartmentalize, and tariffs are a trade issue. NATO is a defense issue. This is this issue. Trump sees the playing field and says, I'm going to use a tool from this toolbox to solve this problem. So if Germany isn't paying enough NATO dues because they are not willing to live up to their 2% commitment, they might get a tariff, which the policymakers at the think tanks in DC will all hyperventilate and say, no, that's a trade issue. That's not a defense issue. And he's saying, no, it's solving my problem here. And so again, and Trump seems to appreciate the fact that tariffs are a tool that that a president can use without Congress. And it is also like a revenue raiser, where the boogeyman is the other country, as opposed to taxing a potential voter or voting bloc.
I mean, let's also add, this administration has not rolled back the Trump tariffs. Right. So I don't see a world in which the vice president, if she wins, is going to then proactively go ahead and rescind most of those tariffs that have been left in place now for many years.
Right. She too wants to win Pennsylvania and Michigan.
Indeed. So, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, great points. It's fascinating. I think we could continue on for many more hours talking about these topics, but I do want to get to some other points that you both have highlighted here of other things to consider post-election, both immediately and then over the next few years. So I'm not sure whether that's you, Scott, or Ryan starting, but back over to you.
Yeah, obviously everybody on this call has a strong opinion on Trump versus Harris and Republican versus Democrat, but regardless of who wins, there are some issues that we know have to be addressed regardless. And so one of them is the government needs to be funded. Scott mentioned the defense bill. That has to be done. And both the defense bill and government funding every year get a lot of things tacked on to them at the end of the year, lower priorities. The debt ceiling is reached on January 2nd, which is the day before the new Congress is sworn in and 2.5 weeks before the new president is sworn in, which means that after the election, before the new Congress, during the lame duck, Congress is going to have to come up with a debt ceiling deal. And those are incredibly painful. And unlike the government shutting down, which has happened, unfortunately, with increasing frequency over the past few decades, the debt ceiling has never been hit, and the ramifications could be catastrophic to the U.S. economy. And we're going to have to rely on a lame duck Congress, potentially not knowing who's going to have the majority in the House or the Senate while they're negotiating this out. AI is not slowing down because we have a divided electorate. China is not slowing down because we have an election. The climate, the growing debt, these challenges have to be addressed. And the only way for a sturdy, durable solution is if it's bipartisan. Because if the Democrats sweep and they pass all this climate legislation, well, eventually the Republicans are going to sweep, whether 2 years or 10 years from now, and they're going to undo it. And when both sides have skin in the game, that's when they're more protective of the bills that have passed. And then finally, 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed under President Trump. Because of the way in which they were passed through a budget reconciliation method, they expire. They're not permanent. They expire in 2025. And no matter who wins, Kamala Harris, as president, does not want to be responsible for tax increases on millions of Americans. Trump doesn't want to either. So there will be a need for a reckoning of extending, expanding, getting rid of some of these provisions from 8 years ago, but in a very different debt and deficit environment, meaning that not everything is going to make it. Some things are going to be on the chopping block, and both parties, Harris and Trump, have identified things that they want to raise taxes on that are currently not part of that. And that means that every business, whether has an international component or purely domestic, or it's involved in trade or financial services or agriculture, is potentially on the chopping block for a revenue raiser to pay for some of the other tax cuts that need to be extended.
Let me just add really quickly, permitting reform, I think, is something of importance to everybody on this call. That is something that we're continuing to see come up time and time again. A couple of nights ago on the House floor, there actually was a bill that was passed that's heading to the president's desk that would waive some NEPA restrictions for CHIPS Act projects. We have seen The Manchin Barrasso Senate compromise permitting bill that passed out of the Energy Natural Resources Committee 14-5. That's incredibly bipartisan. Is there enough time and political will post-election to get that done? Most likely no. Not completely off the table. But that means it's just another thing next year that a bipartisan group of folks are really going to try and focus on.
Great points. Really a packed legislative calendar immediately after the election in the lame duck, and certainly no sign of that slowing down in the future. One other thing I just want to bring up here, I know we're running short of time, but we've been looking ahead to sort of future issues, new legislation, new initiatives that may be going into effect. I think your remarks about the fact that we're more likely to see a divided House and Senate than we are a unified and under one party House and Senate has also relevance to what is going to happen with existing programs that Congress and the administration, both Harris and Trump, have put in place over the past 8 years. And I think there the kind of the takeaway is going back to some fundamentals on U.S. constitutional governance and how Washington works or doesn't work. Is, we have all these various issues that are swirling, many of them related to programs that have already been implemented or that are in the process of being implemented. It does take three parties to make or change a law. And if we have divided government between the House and Senate, you're looking at scenarios where out of the 8 possible outcomes of the November election, one being a total Democratic Party sweep, the other being at the other extreme, a total Republican Party sweep. Most of the other scenarios, and probably the ones that I think, from what I've heard Scott and Ryan say on this presentation, are the most likely, is that you have divided government, at least at some level. And so that is the takeaway from that for purposes of this presentation, is that most of those existing policies, it's going to be more difficult to change them at the statutory level, maybe more room for maneuver, depending on who's president, to do so through regulation or executive order or informal guidance at the agency level through the power of appointments and who is going to be in charge, with the idea that, who is the people involved are in many ways kind of equivalent to what policy you get. But don't expect a sweeping repeal of a lot of legislation that has been passed over the past few years. And Scott, Rod, I don't know if you disagree with that or if you have other comments you'd like to add in the limited time we have left.
Completely agree with what you said, Nate.
Yep.
Yeah, one other thing just to mention here, and then I think we'll wrap it up, is that if you look at some of the funding bills that have passed, including the IRA that Scott was mentioning, you see that in terms of where that funding has gone geographically, a lot of it, interestingly enough, is in Republican districts. So that, with these red circles on the map here indicating both the relative magnitude of the grants or investments that have been made under that legislation, and the coloring indicating which party controls that district, you do see a lot of the funding going into Republican districts. The inference from that is that it then becomes harder for a Republican majority to potentially repeal this legislation if they view their constituency as benefiting from that funding. And you start to have a existing stakeholder or set of stakeholders in your district who care about that project or that funding. It makes it harder to reverse course. So something to watch, particularly if you're interested in some of the funding initiatives that have been implemented or are in the process of being implemented. And maybe back over to Scott and Ryan just for some final thoughts. I think all this illustrates why it's so important to be monitoring and to be engaged in the process. As distasteful as it may seem sometimes to those outside the Beltway, it is very much an important process. It's shaping the future of so many critical issues for both the bearing and gear industries. And I think Ryan and Scott have this nice visual slide at the end to kind of make that point, that this is a time to be engaged and to be monitoring. And certainly if you have questions about that process, we're here to help. Scott, Ryan, any final thoughts?
No, I think we outlined, it's going to be a crazy couple of weeks, and then it's going to be a crazy couple of months. We're most likely not going to know who won the election, at least for a couple of days afterwards, if not longer. And then it's going to be a sprint to the finish line for this year. And then a kind of a sprint when the new members are seated January 3rd, and then when the new administration comes in January 20th. So now is the time to be making these relationships and talking about these critical issues while folks have a little bit of bandwidth until before the sprint begins.
Yeah, I would add just that we kind of walked you through that there's a ton of different scenarios that could happen that's credible. And the challenges and the opportunities presented for your industry. But I can't stress enough that there's going to be trillions of dollars at risk or opportunities for in the next year. And so come up with an engagement plan now, and game out. Okay, if Trump wins, here is how we approach this. If Harris wins, here's how we approach that, so that you're ready to go. Because with trillions of dollars at risk, your competition, and every other industry is gearing up for it as well. And no policymaker wants to make a wrong choice. But the more they hear from one side, they generally start to agree with their viewpoint.
Great points. Ryan, Scott, I can't thank you enough for taking time to join us today. I know you are in high demand to explain what's going on here in Washington, so we really appreciate it. Look forward to the next webinar. It's coming up in a month, and we're going to be talking more about trade, export controls, national security policy. So stay tuned for that. Watch the AGMA website for more on how to register, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next time around. Thanks so much.